Hello, this is Ipo Swords, and today we're going to be looking at this, the pala or kilij. This particular example is a wootz sword from around 1790. The pala or kilij have a few distinct features that are strongly related to the way they're supposed to be used. This discussion is going to focus solely on this style of pala or kilij. This style of pala and kilij have a reinforced spine. Earlier styles did not, and thus this discussion is not applicable to other forms of kilij. Generally speaking, the pala, in this format, is an infantry weapon, being only around 70 centimeters in blade length. This is significantly shorter than you'd expect for a cavalry sword. In their use as infantry swords, these would have been slashing weapons, used in a cross-cutting method. And that's due to the fact that these have a reinforced spine in a T cross-section. They have an extremely thin, fine edge, which is very good at performing draw cuts and slices. They also have an interrupted spine, leaving the end portion of the blade extremely thin, allowing it to pass through a target with ease. While these are a pipe-back sword, they avoid many of the issues that you'd see in a European pipe-back sword, and they do this by focusing entirely on one style of combat, rather than being a cut-and-thrust compromise. These swords cannot thrust at all, due to the fact that they have around only 2 millimeters of blade width here at the end of the spine. This portion of the blade is extremely flexible, and it's also too broad to be particularly useful in a thrusting context. The extremely curved blade also throws your thrusts offline. This is therefore purely a cutting sword. However, unlike most cutting swords, you cannot perform a simple chop with this sword due to the extremely thick spine, which is around a centimeter thick. Thus, these can only be used in a draw cut, or perhaps with a tip cut using the last portion of the blade, like that. There are a few very interesting features that will require bringing the camera closer and taking a look. But first, let's compare it to a British 1822. Perhaps one of the most famous, or rather infamous, pipe-back swords, the British 1822 infantry officer's sword was complained about endlessly during the Crimean Campaign and the Crimean War. It was touted as being entirely too flexible and lacking any cutting authority. In their efforts to make a cut-and-thrust compromise sword, they compromised far too much on both, leading to a sword that is ineffective in any sort of actual combat, and was deflected by many heavy coats used by infantry at the time. The British sword is around 10 centimeters longer than the Ottoman sword. However, it balances closer to the hilt. That's due to the fact that this has a complex, developed hilt. In fact, this style is known as a Gothic hilt. This blade balances around 13 centimeters away from the hilt, whereas this one balances around 17 centimeters away from the hilt. However, this kilij feels much more nimble than this pipe-backed 1822, and that's due to the nodes and the dynamics of this sword and due to the way it's designed. Both of them have a pipe back. However, on the British sword, you'll notice it is only around 2.5 centimeters wide at its widest, whereas the kilij is around 4.5 to 5 centimeters wide in some examples. You'll also note there's an extreme difference in the curvature of these swords, which harkens back to their intended use, with the kilij being entirely for draw cuts and slashing. Neither of these swords are particularly suitable for the thrust. While the 1822 has an appropriate tip geometry in terms of the profile, the pipe-back design makes it far too flexible for any sort of effective thrusting. The kilij has exactly the opposite issue. There is no pipe back on this section of the blade, and it is also far too wide in the profile, meaning it is incapable of performing effective thrusts. However, that compromise brings with it extreme cutting potential. This kilij balances around 18 centimeters away from the crossguard. right before this secondary curve. One of the primary rotational nodes on this sword is around here, in the middle of this secondary curve, which means that when swinging it, you feel most of the force goes into this portion here. And that's very good, because this section of the blade is entirely inflexible. You cannot produce even a few millimeters of flex in the reinforced section with this heavy spine. However, due to that heavy spine, you cannot cut straight into a target, as you'll meet resistance as soon as you hit that spine. And so you must draw the blade through the target until you reach this flat section where there is no spine and can pass through. As a slicing sword, this is an exceptional design. While it is on the short side, it's comparable to other swords used in the region, especially for infantry. The hilt is fairly simple. However, it is worth remembering that shields were still in use in the Ottoman Empire at the time, and thus an overly complex hilt was not necessary. Let me bring the camera closer so we can examine this in detail. In order to fully appreciate the features of the kilij, it is necessary to compare it to a sword with a fairly similar form factor. In order to achieve this, we'll be comparing it to this, a shamshir, which admittedly is around 200 years older than this kilij. However, both are from a fairly similar region of the world, and both have some superficially similar design features. Both feature cross guards with extending langets. Both feature pinned horn scales. They have full-width tang constructions and feature bulbous pommels. However, that is where the similarities end. The blade profiles are completely different. This kilij has an extremely broad blade, being around 4.5 centimeters wide. It also features this pronounced spine. However, the curvature, at least in the front portion of the blades, is fairly similar. While the shamshir has a narrower blade, it is also straight in the initial portion, like the kilij. However, the kilij has a sweeping secondary curve here, versus the shamshir, which has an even curve. The shamshir's blade, while being much narrower, is actually significantly heavier, not only because it's around 15 centimeters longer, but also because it has a lozenge cross-section. This means that for its width, it is extremely heavy, being around 3.5 millimeters thick at its thinnest point. Conversely, the kilij has a blade with around 2 millimeters of thickness in the cutting portion of the blade. The choice of a thick spine thus allows for a design that has extreme cutting and slashing potential while minimizing weight. This particular kilij is made of something called dendritic wootz. It's a later style of wootz than what you would see on the earlier shamshir. Dendritic wootz uses a different ore source to that traditional swirly watered steel. I have not etched this blade, so the contrast is rather low. However, there are some places where you can see oxidation, which reveals some of that dendritic pattern. Let's bring the camera closer and take a look. As you can see here, the scale is made of horn and is pinned with a pair of steel pins on the handle and one near the pommel. The pommel itself is carved out of the same piece of horn as the rest of the handle. The guard is actually made of a hollow copper-like alloy and is filled with a resinous pitch. You can see that some repairs have been done to the sword here. The dendritic pattern of the wootz on this sword can be best seen in this section here, on both sides, where it has some corrosion on the sorbite portions of the blade. The bright white lines that you can see in between this corrosion are cementite, a hard carbide that resists corrosion much more than the soft sorbite, which is low carbon. Here you can see some of the swirling patterns that still remain in the dendritic wootz, or branching wootz. It's very hard to capture on camera. You can also see two bright white lines here across the center of the blade, which indicate that this blade was made via a construction method known as scarf welding. Scarf welding is a process which involves forge welding two pieces of a blade together. In this case, the cutting portion has been made out of wootz, and the ricasso and tang inside the handle have been made of a monosteel or iron. This allows shock absorbance in the handle, while providing an extremely functional blade. This is a traditional construction method. You see it particularly in swords of the 1700s and 1800s. I'm going to try and capture some of the character of the blade, but I don't know how it's going to turn out. This has been Ipo Swords talking about a wootz pala and discussing the general style of the pipe-back kilij, comparing it to the 1822 and to a wootz shamshir. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and liking the video. That's all for today. Until next time, stay sharp.